Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time, and I'm glad that so many of you found a moment to spend with us. My name is Peter Tarnoff, and I am a co-teacher at the journalism school with Mark Danner, which I can assure you is not only a teaching experience, but a learning experience for me. I know we're supposed to be at the teaching end, but I found over the past 4 or 5 years just being with Mark and sharing with him our views on various issues is as much a learning experience as anything else. Over the past 4.5 years, Mark Danner has been exceptionally active as an observer of what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in the United States and the rest of the world with regard to Iraq. He's done so as a correspondent, as an essayist, as a person who has been a commentator frequently on radio and TV. His speaking schedule, which I got a glimpse at earlier today when we were preparing for our class at the J School, would make an active, healthy politician wither at the thought of having to do as much as Mark is doing publicly. So he's out there in a major way, also as an author of articles and op-ed pieces, the author of 2 books that I'll come back to in a moment. And he's therefore an engaged journalist and somebody who cares as much about policy as anyone I've ever come across. But despite all of these accomplishments, and they really are formidable accomplishments, what I think that Mark has achieved above all, and what is at least most meaningful to me, is that he has become a voice of conscience on these issues, which is even rarer than the journalists and the others who have written very good books and very good articles about what's going on in Iraq and elsewhere. And he's become a voice of conscience because he feels deeply, in addition to the politics and the economics and the geostrategic considerations that we all talk so much about, that there are certain moral issues that are at play here. Moral issues that obviously affect our country in particular, but affect what we do with the rest of the world. And there are many examples of this, but let me give you a couple of brief ones. The first is that a couple of years ago, when the revelations came out that the United States was torturing Iraqis at Abu Ghraib and elsewhere in Iraq, there was no one more active than Mark Danner in terms of getting to the truth of what was happening, prodding, writing, talking, being active in a way that he can only do, and making sure that the issue got the kind of attention that would not have been the case if he had not done that. I think all of us, including Mark, although he'll have to speak for himself, obviously, was somewhat frustrated that the issue did not get more concern than it did. But as I was saying to him at the time, and would repeat now, it would have gotten much less attention if Mark Danner had not been as active as he was in making sure that, to the extent that he could, that the American people and the rest of the world were aware of what was going on. And in addition to what he was doing at the time, this produced his first book on Iraq, which I know many of you are familiar with. The second, more recent example is what happened in the past year when something called the Downing Street Memo became public in the media. Downing Street Memo, as you know, was clear proof that the United States and the United Kingdom had colluded for months, even up to a year before the invasion of Iraq, when it came to preparing actively for war. And so while governments, and the United States government in particular, was pretending that diplomatic options were open, and the president was talking about not having a war plan or words to that effect on his desk, the reality was very different. And that was, as the British made clear in their internal communications, that the United States was preparing for war. And this has produced, among other things, Mark's most recent book, which is The Secret Way to War, which you'll be glad to know is available outside, with a signature by Mark Danner after the event. Did I get that right, Mark? I did. Good. And then, yes, the book for a small fee. The other thing I wanted to say is that one would hope that with everything that is going on in Iraq, there would be enough to keep the administration and the rest of us who care about the issues, like all of you, busy. But in recent weeks, another challenge has occurred and loomed large in terms of issues over the horizon. And that has to do with the neighboring country of Iraq, and that is, of course, Iran. One would assume that given the lessons and the tragedy of Iraq, that policymakers and commentators would have learned something with regard to what the United States and others, but the United States in particular, are going to be doing with regard to Iran. And maybe that's the case. Maybe there have been lessons learned, and I know Mark is going to be talking about that in a moment. But I don't think we can take for granted the fact that lessons have been learned, because several years ago we thought other lessons have been learned and we were wrong about it. One thing that we know for sure, thanks in large measure to Cy Hirsch and his piece in the New Yorker 3 or 4 weeks ago, is that the US military is actively preparing war plans for military action against Iran. Not the same kind of military action that took place in Iraq, but very widespread military action as well. It may well be that these are contingency plans. It may well be that there's no date. It may well be that there's no timeline. But if we learned any lesson from what happened in the prior months before the Iraq invasion, is that there again, we should not take this for granted. And I know Mark Danner will not take this for granted. Finally, let me say that I think that Mark is giving us a sense of something that is of overarching importance for the next decade or so in terms of America's role in the world and what will have to be done about it. I think it's also significant, Mark, that you chose May 1st for this talk at your home campus. Now, May 1st, of course, is known to most of us as it used to be International Working Men's Day. It's now International Working Men and Women's Day, you'll be happy to know. Also, May Day happens to be Mark's, MD. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was that, at least for with both feet, is the other meaning of May Day. And those of you who are at least of my generation remember that the May Day distress calls were the international call for the need for assistance when in dire straits. I remember in the years following the Second War, I was watching when I was a kid, watching these grainy black and white movies with the captain on a sinking ship calling into a microphone, Mayday, Mayday, and after having been torpedoed by a submarine. And sometimes the ship would go down and sometimes someone would swoop in and rescue the crowd. Mark, I'm not asking you to rescue the crowd tonight, but I think the issues are important enough for me to say to you, Mayday, Mayday, help us understand what's going on. Mark Danner, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. We had to search far and wide to find somebody who could be so objective about my work. My mother was not available, and we. No, thank you. I will send her a tape. Thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate it. And thank you all very much for coming tonight on this extraordinarily beautiful May Day. I hadn't thought of the international signal for distress. What I was thinking, but I'm thinking of it now. What I was thinking, of course, was that May Day, and what I wanted to gather you all together for, essentially a celebration of, is that May Day is Mission Accomplished Day. Does everybody remember this? Mission Accomplished Day? Yes, yes. And that is what we're celebrating here tonight, Mission Accomplished. I don't mean that ironically at all. I want to start by talking a little bit about that image of Mission Accomplished from precisely 3 years ago tonight, because it strikes me as a moment in time that we should all remember, think about, and try to analyze, because I think it was, in a sense, the gateway into our present world. It seemed to me that the image of Mission Accomplished, which you all remember, marked the high point of the war of imagination that was Iraq, and was the portal into the war of reality that we're still trying to cope with today. I'm going to ask you all, if we at the journalism school had high-tech capability and financing, I would have an enormous screen for you here in which I would be showing George Bush coming out of the plane in his flight suit, which of course he did not need because he was a passenger on the plane, striding across across the deck of the USS Lincoln. The USS Lincoln had been delayed on its trip back to the United States, to San Diego, for this photo opportunity. The sailors would have been there the day before. They stopped it about 35 miles off the coast of California, and in fact, the ship had to be turned around at precisely the so-called magic hour, what cinematographers in Hollywood called the magic hour, around 5 o'clock, turned around so that the cameras would not see the skyline of San Diego, which was clearly visible from the flight deck. I mean, this we know. We also know that when we think about the war of imagination, the question is, if we conjure up that image, whose imagination exactly are we talking about? I'd like to begin with a couple of, well, let me put it this way, several imaginations, which I think were at work that day at the climax of the War of the Imagination. The first, of course, was Karl Rove's. This footage was designed to be the centerpiece of the 2004 campaign of the president striding across the flight deck. It would have dovetailed very well, as you all remember, the footage from 9/11 with the heroic firemen carrying out the body that was used in the campaign. This image was supposed to be essentially the second part of it, the redemption and victory. So the first imagination we're talking about is Karl Rove. The second imagination that I'd ask you to think about is that of Donald Rumsfeld, who saw the war as a way to vindicate his vision of what the future of the American military should be. That is a light, lethal, high-tech, quick military force that could go in, get out, do the job, and impress the world with American prowess. It was not a military that was made, in his view, to occupy countries. It was not a military that was made to fight division-on-division contact engagements. It was a military that was meant to go in and out and shake the world with the power of the United States. The third imagination is that of Paul Wolfowitz, who saw this war as vindicating a vision for democracy in the Middle East, a vision that he believed in, absolutely. And he saw it as an ideological response to the attacks of 9/11. That is, in this sense, one conceive of those visions, those images, excuse me, as directly comparable. On the one hand, the vision of the Twin Towers burning, planes going into them, the vision of collapse. That still is, if you've looked at it lately, still, to me at least, extraordinarily shocking. On the other side, the vision of American victory and the beginning of democracy in the Middle East. So this was, in the mind of Wolfowitz and other neoconservative intellectuals, the ideological response to the attack of 9/11, to what they saw as an ideological attack on American power. Condoleezza Rice said later that the war in Iraq was about switching the vision of young men in the Middle East so they would no longer be tempted to drive airplanes into buildings in New York and Washington. So it was an idea to give them a different view of what the future could be. Finally, well, not quite finally, one more vision, which is the vision of the planners in the Defense Department who had to deal for 20 years and more with the problem of how to secure America's oil lifeline. That is, how do you secure the Middle East after the catastrophe of the Iranian Revolution and the twin catastrophe of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? How do you do that? How do you make American power work in order to secure essentially what is the jugular of the United States, which is the Straits of Hormuz? The Iranian Revolution was a catastrophe, obviously, because that was the heart of America's defense plan for the so-called Central Command, the Shah of Iran and his army. After he fell, the military problem persisted for the next 20 years, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why the United States backed Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, in his war against the Iranian Revolution. For these gentlemen in the Pentagon, the question was, whether Saddam has weapons of mass destruction or not, he remains a problem of national security. What can we do about him? They envisioned, again, a quick victory, a quick answer to the instability of Iraq, and they saw the end of that war of the imagination on the flight deck. And finally, the imagination I want to look at is that of George W. Bush. What was he thinking of that day? Again, I would conjure up before you the image of the Twin Towers, of the attack on the Twin Towers, and the extraordinary blow that constituted to American credibility. That is, there was a necessity for a strong American military victory and a decisive show of American force. You all know, I think now, because the stories have been told many times, that even on the first day of 9/11, according to Richard Clarke, George W. Bush was thinking about an attack on Iraq. And in fact, in the National Security Council meeting that Saturday at Camp David, the morning discussion, Saturday morning, was about whether or not Iraq should be first. And many in the Defense Department, including Paul Wolfowitz, believed that the answer to that was yes. Why? Because that victory would be easier, they thought, easier than Afghanistan. There were more targets, it would be more decisive, and it would provide precisely that vision of triumph, of swagger across the aircraft carrier deck. So that's the war of the imagination. What we're coping with, or trying to cope with today, I think politically, is where that war of the imagination came into or ran up against an immovable object, which is to say the reality of Iraq. Let me say a few words about the Iraqi state, and then talk about the confrontation between American imagination and Iraqi reality. The United States, in intervening in Iraq, confronted, how should I put it, began to take part in a struggle that had been going on within the Iraqi state since at least the early 20s. That is, what was the Iraqi state? How would it exist? And who would rule it? I'm sure everybody in this room knows that Iraq was essentially put together in 1920 after a diplomatic deal between the British and the French. It was comprised of three governorates that had existed independently during the Ottoman Empire: Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. Mosul essentially was traded by the French to the British in exchange for Syria, which is a lovely way to do business. There are quite vivid accounts of this particular tea ceremony that Peter, in particular, as next diplomat, I think would appreciate, which is the way things used to be done. Have some tea, make the deal, put together the state. The problem is, of course, the state has never functioned well. You know, it's interesting, when I look back on the last 3.5 years, we're now well into the 4th year of the Iraqi war. I remember a series of debates, and perhaps some of you were at some of them here on the Berkeley campus and elsewhere, in which I argued against launching the war. It was the first time in my life that I did that I took a public position on an issue like that beforehand. I'm essentially a reporter and a writer. And I look back on that and think, why was I so adamant that this was a bad idea, that this was not going to work? And when I sort of look inside myself and try to work that out, I think about Haiti, which is, I realize, rather strange. Haiti was the first place I really reported from abroad as a very young man. I wrote about the fall of Duvalier. Now, what does Haiti have to do with Iraq? Well, not very much. They're in different parts of the world. Haitians are in no way like Iraqis. But the two regimes have this, Saddam's and Duvalier's have this in common. They're national security states. That is, were in the business of keeping themselves in power. They're made up at their heart of armies, security services, and spy services, secret police. Saddam's regime was remarkably like Duvalier's in that sense. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves when we look at a state like that is, why does it look like that? We're looking at a scene of political dysfunction, essentially, a state that doesn't work. And in the case of Iraq, as in Haiti, you have a history that is essentially instability, divided by periods of autocracy, very harsh autocracy, increasingly harsh autocracy. And Saddam, in a sense, is the answer to a question: how do we hold the Iraqi state together? And his answer was, we do it through the use of force and the use of terror and the use of overwhelming power. And the use of torture. Torture, in this sense, is a way to get the most out of force. You do terrible things to people, you leave the bodies out in public, as Duvalier did as well, and you get the most value for your money. It's a lucrative way to use force, put it that way. So the Iraqi state, essentially, was already in a struggle that the United States intervened in March 2003. The Sunnis had been in power with the help of the British since 1920, 20% minority, and they ruled through terror. The United States proposed to intervene with this war of the imagination and shift power from this 20% minority to a 60% majority, which is the Shiite, the majority in the Iraqi state, who had been suppressed now for 83 years, vigorously oppressed. Now, how exactly do you do that and do it so you don't have an explosion of violence? This is the essential political problem that the United States found itself confronting in Iraq. What is the answer to that? It's a kind of political tightrope that the United States would have had to walk to be successful. How do you do it? The first step is to maintain, in some way, security. Because you have, the key problem is, how do you switch from a minority to majority regime while persuading the minority not to respond violently? How do you do that? What do you do? How do you persuade the minority, the Sunnis, the Baathists, who make up the power structure of the state, 300,000 or 400,000 of whom are secret police, in essence? How do you reassure them that they can live under majority rule, under the rule of the majority that they have suppressed their entire lives, that they have tortured? How do you persuade them that they can live in safety under this new majority, under these new rulers? Well, it's a hard question for political scientists and for others who plan these kinds of things, but I'd suggest a couple of very fundamental answers to that question. One is that you have to maintain and impose a regime of security. That is, you have to convince everybody in the society that they will be safe and that there is, in effect, a reliable mediator in power who will be fair and who will keep them and their children safe. You're beginning to see the problem, I think, when we think of the beginning of the American occupation. The only way to make this work was essentially to have locked down Iraq with a certain number of troops, with the maintenance of a legitimate, the maintenance of, I'm sorry, I can't remember Weber's phrase, but authority consists of attaining a monopoly on legitimate violence, and the United States never did attain that. The key part of establishing democracy is the establishment of a loyal opposition. What does a loyal opposition consist of? It consists of people who agree that they will oppose the regime in power nonviolently, that they believe in the system that's put in place. The United States, this is where the American occupation and Iraqi reality came into the first conflict. Rumsfeld's War of Imagination envisioned a very quick occupation using 130,000, 140,000 troops, and most of those troops would be out by September. So 100,000 troops would be there essentially through the summer months, and they would be gone. As we all know, the number of troops were not sufficient to secure the country. They were not sufficient to keep streets safe. They were not sufficient to allow schools to open. They were not sufficient, first of all, and I think this is the memory that I have most vividly from the early occupation, to stop the looters from overtaking the Iraqi state. You know, we need, I think, when I think about looting, it occurs to me that we need a different word for what happened in Iraq after the Americans came into Baghdad. I spent, when I was a child, one of my hobbies, believe it or not, was ancient Samaria. This is true. I was very interested in the subject, and visions of Baghdad and of Gilgamesh and all the stories of the ancient Middle East were something I was obsessed with as a kid. I'd always wanted to go to the Baghdad Museum. When I arrived, I found room after room of headless statues, because looters had come into the Iraqi Museum, and the statues that they were not able to take out and put in their pickup trucks, they took knives or axes and chopped the heads off, one after another. We're talking about statues that were 4,000, 4,500 years old. And when we think about looting, let me give you a comparison. In the first weeks, when the Americans first came into Baghdad, the streets were given over to young men very often wearing kerchiefs over their face, riding around in pickup trucks. And if they were going to say, take this building, for example, they would drive their pickup trucks outside. They would begin by taking the seats, unscrewing the seats from the floor, taking the clock off the wall, taking the exit signs, taking the flags, the podium, the chairs, then the wood on the stage, then the paneling on the wall, then the wiring out of the wall, the drop ceiling, all of the electrical, the bathroom fixtures, absolutely everything that could move, could be taken, was taken, so that you would be left with a bare concrete shell in which you would have plaster walls and nothing. Then, after, say, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days of engaging in this, filling up their pickup trucks and driving away, they would set the building on fire. And this process took place all over Baghdad, all over Iraq, to the entire Iraqi governmental structure, to every military base, to Baghdad University, and to office buildings 15, 16 stories high that constituted the Iraqi government, basically, in the government's memory. It happened to the National Museum, it happened to the National Archives, and it went on for 6 weeks. And I have the impression that Americans don't have a very vivid picture of this, which is one of the reasons I'm going on about it at some length. While this was happening, Americans, if this was happening to this building, you would have Americans in tanks sitting outside and essentially watching. I interviewed the head of the of the Baghdad Museum, who told me every day while this looting was going on, he would go outside and beg the Americans to come inside and help. Once he persuaded them, because he was so desperate, to move the tank over to the front of the museum, these guys left. They got in their pickup trucks, they left. The Americans, after a few hours, told him they had to move back to their traffic circle because they didn't have orders to stay in front of the museum. They moved back to the traffic circle, the looters returned. And they spent about 2 weeks in the museum, looting it day after day. Now, I'm going on about this at such length because if you imagine what the Iraqi state was like, which is to say relentless, overwhelming security. You could leave your doors open. There was very little street crime. Leave your doors unlocked. You could trust when your children wandered off to go to school. And if you did not become involved in politics in any way, you were fairly safe. Imagine a society that had grown up with that kind of security and that kind of regime given over to this kind of tumult for 6 weeks, and watching as the Americans watched that tumult going on in the street. So the American occupation began with this overwhelming shock to the Iraqi body politic, which was, okay, you know, we are going to destroy the Iraqi state, we're going to let criminals run wild, do whatever they like, and we are going to do nothing to intervene. This was the first impression most Iraqis had of Americans. After that is the killing of the first stages of the war, which killed probably somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 civilians. So this is their first exposure to the Americans as a force on the ground. During this, it's clear that a lot of this looting was partly initiated by followers of Saddam. We found documents since then that envision looting the Iraqi state as the first stage of the resistance. Soon after that looting, or actually as that looting was going on, a number of things were found that was clear evidence that a resistance had been planned while Saddam was still in power. Notable in this, and I remember this vision very well because CBS News did a piece on it, was a school, an elementary school. Elementary schools, many of them had arms caches in them that were, some of you may remember these images, but one in particular in the Adamiyah neighborhood of Baghdad had several hundred garments on these clothing racks of the sort you see in dry cleaner shops. They were all shrink wrapped in plastic. What were those garments? They were suicide vests. They had been prepared beforehand en masse. And that was the first indication that you had had the beginnings of a resistance that was planned long before the entry of the Americans into Baghdad. So by shortly after this image, by shortly after May Day, we started to see the evidence of this planned resistance. Americans started to be shot one-on-one, American soldiers. In Baghdad University, I met a number of people who had been standing there when a young man, a student, had come up behind an American who was enjoying a Coke and shot him in the head. And this started to happen all over Baghdad and also in the south of Iraq. By late summer, suicide bombings had begun. These bombings were carefully structured to essentially build on an obvious weakness of the occupation. That weakness was isolation. That is, the United States went into Iraq without the support of the international community. And the Iraqi insurgency, part of that insurgency in any event, decided that that was the weakness that must be capitalized on. So you saw a series of attacks, suicide attacks, that were extremely powerful and extremely effective. The first of them was against the United Nations. It's as if one by one, these little thin cords that connected the American effort to the outside world were being snipped. First of all, the Canal Hotel where the UN was based was bombed, killing the wonderful UN envoy, Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was a critical figure at that point in the occupation. He was killed along with 21 colleagues. Next, the Jordanian embassy was hit. There was talk at that time about bringing in Arab forces to help patrol and help support the occupation. Boom, the Jordanian embassy was hit. All talk of Arab support was, military support ended there. There was talk of the Turks coming in and possibly supporting the occupation. Boom, the Turkish embassy was hit. So we saw very targeted, very intelligently managed attacks using suicide bombs, mostly car bombs, on particular proposals that would have helped end the American isolation during the summer of 2003. And by the fall, the insurgency was going full tilt. The problem is, from my perspective when I look back now, that the war of the imagination, at least in American terms, had not ended. The administration was continued to be committed, and this is a very human thing, I think, that we're unable to give up our illusions. The administration was still committed to that image of George Bush striding across the flight deck, that image of a quick victory, that image of a decisive return of American credibility to put beside the image of the Twin Towers. And the administration did not adjust. This is where we get into issues that have preoccupied me, like torture, for example, because torture, or extreme interrogation, as the government has been calling it, essentially is an epiphenomenon of a failure of intelligence. That is, how do you fight an insurgency? How do you fight people who are fighting you but who look just like everybody else? How do you pick out the fighters from among the Iraqi population? How do you know who the bad guys are? Tanks don't help, artillery doesn't help, modern aircraft don't help, even Predator drones don't help. What you need is intelligence. What you need is a cooperative population. And the population by the fall of 2003 was anything but cooperative in Iraq. They had just spent a summer with no electricity, among other things. Iraq in the summertime Baghdad is about 120 degrees. And when I first went in October 2003, I heard from Iraqi after Iraqi that Saddam had been able, after the Gulf War, to restore electricity in 4 weeks. And the Americans, it had been 4 months, and the Americans had not managed to do it. And all of these Iraqis who spoke to me about this believed that the Americans were perfectly capable of doing it, and for some reason were refraining from doing it, to punish the population, to degrade the society. There must be some point to this, because the idea of simply saying, well, perhaps we're incompetent, which I suggested a few times, helpfully, was not acceptable to them. I wrote in the first piece I did about torture in Iraq that there was a joke going around in the fall of 2003 about torture, essentially. At the time, many Iraqis also told me that there was a great deal of torture going on at Abu Ghraib. I didn't know if this was true, couldn't try, made an effort to confirm it, but wasn't able to. But the joke was, the rumor was that the Americans were using electricity on Iraqis. And the joke was that I always knew the Americans would be able to bring electricity back to Baghdad. I just didn't know they'd be shooting it up my ass. This was popular in October and took on new meaning in April 2004. We just passed that anniversary when CBS News and the New Yorker, CBS News broadcast, the New Yorker published the images from Abu Ghraib, which is now almost exactly 2 years ago. So these were, it seems to me, the early dramatic failings of the occupation. American imagination meeting Iraqi reality. By late fall of 2003, we started to have change in military deployments. We started to have a very slow recognition that an insurgency was being fought. But by then, this had been going on more than 6 months, and the insurgents had attained a kind of base and a kind of replicating or self-sustaining momentum that has continued to this day, because the insurgency is still growing as we speak. The numbers that you hear from the Department of Defense for the last 2 years now have been 15,000 insurgents in Iraq. It's fascinating. I'm reminded of Vietnam here because 15,000, and if you look at the aggregate numbers of the number of insurgents who have been detained or killed, it's above 60,000. So during the last 3 years, the United States has killed or detained 60,000 insurgents, and month after month, the number of insurgents has remained at 15,000, which is an artifact of, obviously, of statistics, and doesn't tell you much about the war itself. Let's talk a little bit about the war itself, and how it's going. That is the reality that we're looking at right now. I was looking today, I was trying to find an objective source, the search for an objective source. You know, I found it with my introducer, Peter, but I needed one. I needed one when it came to the war itself. I found a report by the Government Accounting Office, which is the essentially the think tank of Congress. When Congress wants clear information having to do with a bill that they're thinking of passing or whatever, they commission the Government Accounting Office to do a report. They came out the other day with a report on Iraq, and it makes fascinating reading. My favorite part, and again, I apologize for the lack of high tech here, is this map. What I'm going to tell you, all you need to know about this map is you don't want to live in an orange or red area. Essentially, the red area, which is Anbar province, is critical. Critical being, and I love this language, denotes a province that has, 1, a government that is not functioning or not formed, 2, an economy that does not have the infrastructure or government leadership to develop and is a significant contributor to instability, and 3, a security situation marked by high levels of AIF activity, assassinations, and extremism. Does anybody know what AIF stands for? It's one of my favorite American military acronyms. Well, it's the word for the insurgents, and it means anti-Iraqi forces. I didn't make that up. I wish I had. So that's Anbar province. The orange areas are denoted as Sirius, which denotes a province that, again, has a government that is not fully formed or is not capable of serving the needs of its population. Economic development is stagnant with high unemployment, a security situation marked by routine AIF activity, assassinations, and extremism. Now that we're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of Iraq's 18 provinces fit into those two categories, including Baghdad and Mosul, which is to say almost 50% of the population lives in areas that fit in either of one of those two categories. Finally, you probably think, oh, what the hell, we'll move to the yellow areas. But no, you can't do that, because that denotes a province that, while the government functions, there are areas of concern, such as the inability to deliver services, the influence of sectarian elements, an economy in which unemployment is still a serious concern, and the security situation is under control, but where conditions exist that could quickly lead to instability. And this is essentially the entire south of Iraq, the Shia areas. Now, one of the interesting things about this report is its summary of where we are now. And let's see, the insurgency intensified. Again, this is a nonpartisan report based on information from the American military and from the US Embassy in Iraq. So it's the best picture Congress could put together over the last several months. Let's see, over the last 3 years, significant increase in attacks against the coalition and coalition partners, as well as recent increases in sectarian violence, have made it difficult for the United States to achieve its political and security goals. The insurgency intensified from June 2003 through October 2005 and has remained strong and resilient. The most recent figures and number of attacks are that they've gone up more than 25% between last year and this, and that represents a steady increase. The insurgency intensified through October 2005. Particularly the Sunni insurgency grew in complexity, intensity, and lethality from June 2003 through early 2005. Let's see, attack levels ebb and flow as the various insurgent groups, almost all of which are an intrinsic part of Iraq's population, that is, these are not outsiders, rearm and attack again. Overall attacks increased by 23% from 2004 to 2005. And again, if you look at this report, you see basically a sawtooth pattern very familiar to social scientists, which shows up, down, but generally goes up, continues to go up. An increasingly complex armed opposition continues to be capable of maintaining a consistently high level of violent activity across Iraq. Baghdad, Mosul, and the western province of El Anbar have been experiencing the worst violence. Let's see. Of Iraq's 18 provinces, 1 is critical, high level of insurgent activity, assassinations, and extremism. 6 provinces, including Baghdad and Basra, which is the second largest city in the country, have routine insurgent activity, assassinations, and extremism. I'm giving you the good stuff and the encouraging stuff. Iraqi Sunnis' disaffection is likely to remain high in 2006, even if a broad, inclusive national government emerges. Insurgents share the goal of expelling the coalition from Iraq. Now, these are a lot of different groups that share a number of goals. One is expelling the coalition from Iraq and destabilizing the Iraqi government to pursue their individual and at times conflicting goals. It's a very important point. It means that the United States presence has one very obvious effect. It unifies the insurgency because they, in fact, have differing political agendas. But the one thing they agree on is the necessity of getting the United States out. Iran provides guidance and training to select Iraqi Shia political groups and weapons and training to Shia militant groups to enable anti-coalition attacks. This is in the south. So we go from Sunnis who are attacking the U.S. in the center and the west, Shia who are doing it in the south. Iran also has contributed to the increasing lethality of anti-coalition attacks by enabling Shia militants to build improvised explosive device with explosively formed projectiles, similar to those developed by the Lebanese Hezbollah. When I was in Iraq in November, the leading general in Baghdad, the commander of Baghdad, American general, stood up and demonstrated to me the technology of these special IEDs, which can destroy large armored vehicles, and apparently, at least according to him and this report, are made in Iran. Now, I'll stop reading this in a second, but I think, as I say, the objectivity is worthwhile because in our political debate in the country, there's an impression that people are against the war, they think it's going badly. People are for the war, they think it's going all right. And it's the press who's being negative about the war, which essentially isn't true. If you look at any of the studies of what's going on the ground, it's very difficult to find any that are optimistic. Any. Okay. Increased levels of sectarian strife and the sectarian nature of the violence, particularly in ethnically mixed areas of Iraq, is increasing. Now, you get the point, but I want to make one more point, which is the current strategy of the United States, the strategy for victory, will be familiar to those who remember Vietnam, which is, it's essentially Iraqization, which is reminiscent, of course, of Vietnamization, Richard Nixon's word, which I, as a child, never quite understood. Vietnamization didn't make sense to me. The notion is turning over the responsibility for Iraqi security to the Iraqis. You've heard the president say this, as they stand up, we will stand down. That is his phrase. This is our strategy. This is the Iraq strategy for victory. We are forming a central army to replace the one that we dissolved in May 2003. It will allow the United States troops to leave. There's a problem with that, however. Iraqis have become increasingly concerned that civil war may break out. Iraqis in Baghdad and the central and northern Sunni areas have lost confidence in the ability of the Iraqi army and police to improve the security situation. At the same time, support for the armed resistance increased in Sunni areas, and Iraqis in Shia areas expressed confidence in two large Shia militias, the Badr organization and the Mehdi army. And finally, the Director of National Intelligence, that is the American Director of National Intelligence, testified that Iraqi security forces are experiencing difficulty in managing ethnic and sectarian divisions among their units and personnel, while the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency reported that many elements of the Iraqi security forces are loyal to sectarian and party interests. I'm sorry to read so much to you, but this is Congress's view of what's going on in Iraq right now, Congress's think tank's view. And to me, the key element here is not simply that insurgent attacks are going up. It's not simply that trust in the government is going down since the elections. But it is that the security situation is not only deteriorating, Iraqis are losing faith in the institution in which the American government has put its faith to save the situation in Iraq. That is, the National Army, which the U.S. is paying a vast amount of money to build, is increasingly not trusted by Iraqis. One of the obvious reasons for this, as pointed out recently in Foreign Affairs, a very good article by Stephen Biddle, is that if you have a war that's essentially sectarian, that's one political group in the country fighting against the other, it's impossible to fix this by building a national army which will, in fact, either reflect those sectarian stresses, which we just saw is in fact the case in Iraq, or that solves them by excluding one particular sect. And what we're building in Iraq right now is an army that's dominated by Shia and Kurds, and that leaves out most Sunnis. Sunnis increasingly are joining the insurgency. It's a situation that I saw reporting in Bosnia, where as the lethality of the war gets worse, as more and more it's impossible to stand on the sidelines, you become forced to join an armed group. Even if you despise Radovan Karadzic or these other nationalist, populist demagogues, you need to protect your family. So you join somebody with guns. And that increasingly is happening in Iraq. Mentioning Bosnia reminds me that I've seemed to have lived long enough to see places I've covered used as positive examples of how to fight wars. I'm talking about the Salvadoran option, for example. Has anybody heard that phrase used lately? I was on a panel over the weekend in Los Angeles in which a military theorist on this panel, a very smart man, talked about the single instance of American success in fighting a counterinsurgency was Salvador, in which, of course, between 75 and 100,000 civilians were massacred. But as he said to me, well, it's stable now, isn't it? Which indeed is true. It is relatively stable now. But you may remember that about 6 months ago, there was a good deal of publicity. It was a little blip, a trial balloon that came clearly out of the Pentagon about the Salvadoran option. Did anybody see that or remember it? Yeah, there were several articles about it, notably in Newsweek. The idea of the Salvador option is essentially to use, irregular forces to fight against the insurgency. And increasingly in Baghdad and other cities in Iraq, as I'm sure you all have been reading, a feature of the morning, of getting up in the morning for urban dwellers, is to find heaps of bodies on the street, as it was in Salvador for almost a decade. Which is to say, you're getting groups who are organized apparently out of the Iraqi Interior Ministry, groups of Shia militiamen who are going out seizing young Sunni men, because that's essentially what it's about, simply targeting a group of people who, if they aren't yet insurgents, are destined to become insurgents, and killing them. Usually after torturing them. The preferred method of torture is the use of an electric drill, first on the limbs into the bone and then on the skull, which is what Saddam used for many years. So the level of violence and killing in Baghdad has attained, the latest figures we have, which are for February and March. February, there were 1,400 violent deaths in Baghdad. Now, how can we think about that number? Well, Iraq is about a 13th the size of the United States, or maybe a 15th. So think of somewhere between 16 and 20,000 violent deaths a month in the United States. I think 56,000 died during the entire course of the Vietnam War. So we're talking about levels of violence that are absolutely extreme, astonishing levels of violence. The violence increasingly is, as the report suggests, sectarian. It's one group fighting against another. The insurgents are organized in their original Ba'athist cells, because Saddam's government was originally a conspiratorial group before it took power. They've now reorganized themselves in a very similar way. And the Shia forces are organized into militias, which leads me to one of my final points about the war of the imagination, which is that the United States is no longer controlling this war. The United States is no longer controlling this war. And part of the debate in this country, the part that I guess most fascinates me, is the assumption by American officials and American politicians that there is a solution to Iraq that must be found by Americans, when in fact it seems to me that the United States has completely lost the initiative in Iraq. The debate in this country has taken on the form of, as the president has defined it, we should either stay the course or we can cut and run, which is a great way to define the discussion, obviously a bit tendentious. But the fact is that sometime in the fall, the United States will start drawing down troops. Now, why do I say that, and why should you listen to me? Well, a couple of days ago, in Baghdad, you remember the photo opportunity where Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld, sitting together, were in Baghdad representing the coming together the mating, I guess, of the State Department and the Defense Department, finally in a kind of bliss that they've been searching for since the beginning of the war. I'm sorry, that's an awful image, isn't it? Well, during that photo opportunity, Mufaq al-Rubai, who is the National Security Advisor of Iraq, said the following: "We have a definite plan now for a conditions-based agreement between the Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi government, and the United States government for the Iraqi security forces to assume responsibility gradually. Certainly at the end of this year, there will be a sizable gross reduction of troops. In the next couple of years, we would hope that most of the coalition forces will go home safely." Now, he says we will hope, of course, that's not a guarantee. But I would be very surprised if you didn't have a significant drawdown of U.S. troops by the end of the year, and a continual drawdown during the beginning of next year. The president will not admit it. He has said publicly several weeks ago in a comment that I think deserved a lot more scrutiny than it got, that this is a decision for the next president to make. Did all of you hear that comment? Yeah, I know. I was a little startled by it. But in fact, the United States is starting to say goodbye to Iraq, very gradually, but I think definitively. What does that mean? Should we mourn it? Should we be happy about it? How should we feel about this war of the imagination? I guess the first question to ask is, will things get worse or will they get better after the United States leaves? I think there's a substantial possibility, and my friend Peter Tarnoff and I disagree on this perhaps, that things will get worse, that you'll have a kind of political deterioration in which insurgents will be fighting militiamen, the National Army will simply become one more militia on the street, violence will assume an even larger scale than it has up to now, and it will go on for several years. I think that's a significant possibility. I believe that Peter thinks that essentially after the sine qua non for the Iraqi polity to heal itself and come to a kind of agreement, a modus vivendi, is the departure of American forces. Because American forces now serve a number of functions, but the most obvious is they give ideological cover to the insurgency. They give the cover of nationalism to the Sunni forces on the ground. I know in my title I said the reality and legacy of Iraq, and I was determined to be at least a little bit optimistic at the end. I don't think I've been that optimistic thus far. But I'm determined to be optimistic at least on a couple of, or on one front anyway, and that is the parenthetical question that was in the middle of this, this title, which was, and is Iran next? Many of you may have been noticing that the saber has been rattling very loudly, and that the dates, the sort of constellation of dates and other forces seem eerily familiar at the moment. That is, a very difficult midterm election is approaching in November. We're starting to hear large statements from the political leadership of this country about the Iranian state and how it threatens the United States, how the U.S. cannot tolerate Iran securing a nuclear weapon for itself. And as Peter pointed out, Cy Hirsch and other very good reporters have done pieces out of the Pentagon and elsewhere and the intelligence agencies suggesting that the American government is preparing itself for an attack, probably by air, since there are no ground forces available at this point, but probably by air on the Iraqi nuclear the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. I tend to think that this is very unlikely, that this attack will not happen. I may be proved wrong, perhaps, but I was going to say that the reality view of this situation would suggest this is not in American interests. And I'm remembering that this talk began with comments about the war of the imagination, that this administration has not been the best in dealing with reality, essentially. I still think, though, that if you look at the downside of an attack on Iran, there's several obvious things that stare you in the face. The first is that on the international oil markets right now, there is 1 million barrels a day excess capacity, which is to say that that's it. That's how much play you have in the system. The Iranians are currently exporting 4 million barrels a day. So they essentially themselves have the power through their own sovereign decision to send oil prices beyond $100 a barrel. They could do it tomorrow. Second, the Iranians have enormous power in the south of Iraq. They essentially control the security service down there and have very close connections to the Shia militia in the southern part of the country. In effect, they can move to cause the United States enormous problems in a place where it's deeply vulnerable, where its forces are vulnerable by a series of attacks in the south. And I think some of these attacks that were mentioned in the report using improvised explosive devices made in Iran are in a sense a signal that they can do that. That is a sign that, in fact, whenever they like, the Iranians can bloody the Americans very badly. And finally, Iran is a state that is extremely adept at terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, assassination, suicide bombings, etc. And an attack on Iran would certainly call forth that kind of response, to which the United States is deeply vulnerable. So an attack on Iran, we would exchange whatever number of years that's able to buy the United States in delaying the Iranian nuclear program for sky-high oil prices, a recession, certainly, if that happened, attacks in the south of Iraq that well might make the U.S. position there untenable, and terrorism of an order that's quite hard to predict. So I think that rational people looking at this will decide not to go forward. Even though the political constellation of forces suggests that is the coming election, the fact that the president's numbers are so low that the only place they can go is national security. The leader of the war on terror, which is a well that they have visited now twice during 2 elections, and which is showing signs of essentially being exhausted. The question is, what else do they have? I'd like to finish by reading a paragraph that I like very much, and it's from it's a quote by an unnamed Bush administration official, which you all probably are familiar with. It's from a New York Times Magazine piece by Ron Suskind, which appeared about 2 months before the 2004 election. And this is my attempt at optimism. I'm going to try anyway. Anyway, this is an unnamed aide, who probably was Karl Rove. And this is the reporter writing about his meeting with this aide. The aide said that guys like me, that is reporters, commentators, were in, quote, in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe, quote, which he defined as people who, quote, believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality, close quote. I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously, as you will, I love that parenthetical, and while you're studying that reality, judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Now, I keep promising you optimism, and I'm trying to figure out how to get there from here. I am going to choose to view our current political situation as the nascent revenge of the reality-based community. That is that the Bush administration has been extraordinarily skillful in shaping the image and vision of America and of itself it wants the country to see. And the key image, the anniversary today, 3 years ago, of that vision of George Bush swaggering across the flight deck, so carefully constructed to be the key image of the war, of resurgent America, of the response to the towers, the doomed towers, and I should say of the return of the Republican Party as the party that keeps America safe. We have gone through now 3.5 years, or actually 4 years, of, I think, a degree of manipulation that is perhaps unprecedented in American history. I just wrote a book, as Peter said, called The Secret Way to War, which contains, the most valuable part of the book, a set of documents that give a fairly lucid, brilliantly lucid, really, picture of what the planning was 8 months before the Iraq War. And it's very clear from these documents, though very few people seem interested in reading them, that the war came first, the justification for it came later. You know, that simple perception, so clearly put in this kind of English public school language in these documents, to me defines our current political predicament. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction that, of course, do not exist. We're waiting for an investigation of that will give us a public accounting of a story that we know took place, but that we can't agree as a society took place. We can't agree on a common story because essentially we have a government that's in the control of one party. We are subject to a series of revelations that continue to repeat one another about torture, about wiretapping, about weapons of mass destruction. But amid all that, we live in a political world in which the Bush administration has reached historic lows in its approval ratings, in which it has reached a kind of point of sterility, and in which, for most Democratic polities, the answer would be very clear, which is that the conflict between the Bush administration and reality, and the reality-based community, would need to be resolved at the ballot box in November. It will be seen whether that happens. I suppose you know my opinion on that subject. But I think I look at the polls now, I look at what's happening in public opinion, and I look at the current travails of the Bush administration, and even, yes, the saber rattling about Iran, and see it not only as a tragedy, but see it as the revenge of reality. That image came face to face with reality in Iraq, and reality, for all the tragedy it represents, triumphed. Perhaps triumph is the wrong word, but it did win. Anyway, that's my attempt at optimism. I thank you very much for listening to me. I would be very glad to take any questions you had about anything, whether it's the war or the war on terror or whatever you like. I think Josh Jelly Shapiro, the excellent assistant, has a microphone here that he would pass around. Thank you very much for listening. Yes, sir. Thank you. What's that? Sure, or, you know, whatever, anybody who's...
Is this on? Tagging on to your sense that the situation on the ground in Iraq will deteriorate once the U.S. starts withdrawing its forces, can you maybe talk a bit about how this might become a regional conflict with Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia entering the conflict? And secondly, let's say in a parallel universe that, let's say...
I've driven you into a parallel universe.
Well, let's say with the midterm elections that the Republicans lose control of the Senate and the House, and someone comes to you for advice about whether or not impeachment proceedings should be implemented against George Bush, what would you say?
Well, those are two very good but very different questions, obviously. The question of regional involvement is a very good and is an extremely important one, I think. You know, Iraq, again, reminds me a little of Bosnia because it does sit on this classic civilizational or sectarian crossroad as Bosnia does. Bosnia, you have obviously the Muslims in Europe, but you also have Orthodox Christian Serbs on one side and Catholic Croats on the other. Iraq, Shia, Sunnis, and of course Kurds also. So the potential for pulling in neighboring states is very great because it's a borderline. Iran is involved certainly on the side, very heavily on the side of its brethren, its Arab brethren in Iraq. And the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Syrians are involved in supporting the Sunnis. So there's a very large potential for this. I mean, you know, we talk about potential. It's a fascinating thing or trope of how we speak. We will say things like, if such and such happens, there could be civil war. And of course, it's unclear what civil war would actually be. It's unclear what deterioration involving neighboring states would look like, since those neighboring states are already involved. So the question is, at what point does that become so serious and significant that the entire region is destabilized, in that great political science word? I have a piece here about Bahrain, which is 70% Shiite, and where you're getting a mounting level of political violence, suicide bombings and other things. And the intelligence report I have here from an open source site suggests that this is another way that the Iranians are signaling to the US, because this is where the Fifth Fleet is based, in Bahrain, that they have the power to hurt the United States all over the region. I think that certainly is the great risk of American departure. There's no question about it. The question is, you know, for the last couple of years, I think 2 years ago, I first suggested in a piece in the New York Review that there needed to be a regional negotiation here, that the only way to settle this question was going to be the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Turks, the Iranians sitting down with the Americans and representatives of their clients in Iraq to come to some kind of grand bargain, because the neighboring states, almost without exception, have a strong interest in this state not splitting up, which could be terribly violent. I think that moment, again, Peter and I disagree on this. I think that moment has, or actually we don't, he agrees with this, that moment has passed, because I think the United States doesn't have anything to offer these other players. I think the most optimistic view to take is that if the United States withdrew, those states would start talking to one another, and the key players here are the Saudis and the Iranians. You know, many of these outsiders coming over the border are Saudis. We know that. It's not publicized very much because, of course, they're our central ally, so they can't. It has to be the Syrians, but in fact, that's not true. So I think there's significant risk that it could devolve and become more violent with support of neighboring states. Impeachment, boy. You know, the fact is, the simple reality is that under the scenario you've suggested, which is that the Democrats don't secure one of the two houses or both houses of Congress in November, under that scenario there could not be an impeachment. Unless the Republicans got really angry, which this is not like the Republican Party. I could see the Democrats impeaching a Democratic president. That would be like the Democrats. But I can't see the Republicans impeaching a Republican president. I'm not sure, you know, just to look at that in a parallel universe, as you suggested, as a thought experiment, I'm not sure what precisely the high crimes and misdemeanors would be. Although, you know, I know there's a significant movement. You have groups out who are kind of organizing to support impeachment. There certainly was a great deal of mendacity leading up to the war. The problem is, and this is the problem we're living with now, is that the political opposition is compromised because they supported the war. And this is the simple reality. You know, today there was a piece, I brought it to wave in the air, on the op-ed page, Unity Through Autonomy in Iraq. This is Joseph Biden writing with Les Gelb, the former head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Joseph Biden, of course, is a Democratic presidential aspirant. A few weeks ago, John Kerry did a similar piece. I'm sure Hillary Clinton, keep your eyes peeled. She'll do, everybody's coming out and curtsying and showing us their dresses on the Democratic, I shouldn't say that, but on the Democratic side. They all have to do it. The problem is that, as I say, in my opinion, they're compromised by their support of the war. And they have a problem because there isn't a solution to Iraq. What they need is not a solution, but they need a plan that seems like it might be a solution. Peter and I were talking today that it reminds me of President Nixon's secret plan on Vietnam. He didn't have a plan either, but it was secret. And the Democrats do, but they're showing us what it is, because you need to have a plan. So anyway, I guess I don't think impeachment is in our future. I hope perhaps a more predictable change of political power in either the Senate or the House is, and I think that's quite possible if some of the people who are so disgusted would actually go and vote, which of course doesn't happen very much, unfortunately. We're told to do this with the microphone, not only so you can hear, but for the recording.
Thank you very much. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I think you gave too much credit to Paul Wolfowitz and the neocon crowd by suggesting that they really believe in democracy. I mean, I don't think that fits into their ideology of elitism. And advocating for democracy is a good thing. I don't think it should be credited to these people. The question that I have is, right now with all the buzz about Iran, how can we evaluate the validity of the claims of the two sides? I mean, one is a liar, rogue regime, and the other one is, well, Iran. So how can we know which side tells the truth?
Well, thank you. That was artfully composed, that question. Well, it's hard to know who's telling the truth. I mean, there was a similar problem before the Iraq War. I've been pretty critical and am in this book about the press and the way the period running up to the war was covered. But one should remember that the case that the administration chose to persuade Americans to support the war, and the war was already decided on, this was a question of how can we sell it, relied on two strands of reasoning that the press does not do a good job in covering. The first is history. They said Saddam twice attacked his neighbors and gave a very distorted view of his history, in my opinion. The second was intelligence information, which the government has control of, essentially. And they essentially doled out this information to chosen reporters, like, trainers holding fish out to SEALs, and the SEALs who jumped highest, like Judy Miller and Michael Gordon and others, got the fish and put it on the front page. So they were in a dominant, they managed that very well. And if the war had been successful, we wouldn't be talking about weapons, even if they hadn't been found. We wouldn't be talking about them. So we have the same, we're in to some degree the same situation with Iran, except that it's happened before. So people are skeptical. We also have a head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who's won a Nobel Peace Prize last year, has a lot of credibility, said weeks before the Iraq War that Iraq had no nuclear program, that the documents on Yellowcake were fake. That was in the New York Times as well, and in the Washington Post and other papers. And he is, he has a lot of credibility, and he's given a lot more attention now than he was the same man before the Iraq War. About the actual program and where it stands at this point, I think there's some degree of consensus that they're 5 to 7 years away, if they make steady progress, in weaponizing and actually coming up with a weapon. So given that fact, it seems difficult for the administration to drum up a case for an immediate attack. That doesn't mean they can't do it, and perhaps they'll try to do it. But I agree with you that there's a real problem of information here, and it's one of the reasons why governments like to base their wars on secret events. You know, the Tonkin Gulf incident was not an easy thing for reporters or congressmen to investigate. This is, you know, an appeal. You base your public case on something that the public cannot check. And it's a very common, I mean, Goebbels, I think in this book, I quote Goebbels proposing the same way to start a war in 1941, I think the quote was from. You know, stage an event, people can't check it out, you'll immediately get support for war. So this is very old hat thing in politics.
There have been a number of articles, but even books recently, which suggest that worldwide production of petroleum is either just past its peak or at its peak or about to hit its peak, and that it will be a, people differ by a couple of years or something.
Right.
Although, and meanwhile, demand is increasing dramatically, with China and India growing very rapidly, and
yes,
growth throughout the rest of Southeast Asia, among other places. And so, and in particular, it's been noted that the Soviet Union, although it's a major exporter of gas right now, has already passed its peak oil production. The U.S. has long since passed its peak oil and gas production. And so my question, and so in this, if this is true, then $75 a barrel oil is not a transient phenomena that's a byproduct of some current dispute in Nigeria or Iraq or something, but is the prelude to steady increases in the price of oil as we pass the peak and as demand increases worldwide, unless we have a worldwide recession or something like this. So could you comment on your assessment of these of this issue and what you think the implications will be for U.S. policy in the Middle East? Or action, I don't know. I'm not sure I would call our current thing a policy, but.
Well, my assessment. You know, the U.S. has weathered, since I've been an adult, several so-called oil shocks. A lot of this has to do with how we define crisis. You know, there are these things called permanent crises. You know, there's the energy crisis. It continues, but in fact, prices have gone down since the early 80s, and I think they're still somewhat lower than they were in 1981, 82 in constant dollars. You know, you may be right. The factual sort of landscape you laid out when it comes to oil resources, I'm not competent to evaluate. What I do know is that a lot of people disagree with what you said. We have a man named David Goldwyn, excuse me, who was a former Assistant Secretary of Energy, who came and spoke at the journalism school under the Goldman program a few months ago, and he believes that supplies actually are going to increase, or at least that's his assessment. You know, the simple fact, it seems to me, is that the United States security is dependent for the foreseeable future on supplies of petroleum products from the Middle East and from regions that are increasingly unstable. The higher prices will lead possibly to policy decisions that will lead to a cut perhaps in consumption. But I think that's a long way off. You know, we're starting to get the beginnings of some policy changes. It hasn't yet affected CAFE standards, for example, which means that the political aristocracy in this country would have to actually confront Detroit and the problems in Detroit and somehow work that out to demand higher CAFE standards for automobiles. So we're not, what I'm trying to say is that we're at the very beginning plateau. If this is a crisis, we're right at the bottom. We're not yet at least as far as the political system is concerned. The relevant fact seems to me is that this is a region that we have put ourselves in position of depending on for our lifeline, for our economic lifeline. And it means that we are tied up in a region in which political deterioration, degradation, and failure to modernize are the key items, the key political facts. That you have autocracies that the United States has supported for 50 or 60 years, like the Saudi autocracy, that have huge populations of young people who are upset, dissatisfied, and desperate, and view the United States as the source of their own oppression, which is really the significance to me of 9/11, that these groups, who are radical conservative groups, decided that they couldn't overthrow the Saudi regime, they couldn't overthrow the Egyptian regime. The way to get to these regimes was to attack the United States, the far enemy, because these regimes depended on the US for their power. And that's the reason that Wolfowitz, it seems to me, and I didn't mean to give him too much credit, but what I meant when he was trying to respond with an idea, he was trying to respond to that problem. How do we deal with political modernization in the Middle East when we are dependent on that region and we also have supported these autocracies for decades? And Iraq, in this context, was kind of a metaphysical gamble. We're going to bust them up. We're going to go in there and bust them up with American power and alter the conversation. It was an enormous gamble, but it was based on the fact that we're dependent for our lifeline on this region of increasing instability and autocracy. And I only see it growing more unstable. I don't see any other way out. These regimes are brittle. You've seen, I hope people have been following what's been going on in Egypt. It's fascinating. The United States, I mean, we're looking here at a lot of different storylines that are very interesting that began essentially with the US saying that it was going to support democracy in the Middle East. Now, you can say that this is completely, cynical or hypocritical, but in fact, there's a process going on in various countries that began partly with that statement and that at least stated determination. And we see one place after another where it's leading. In Egypt, the government is now repressing a kind of nascent movement to have outside judges look at elections. And you're having actually huge police action on the street to suppress these demonstrations. In the West Bank, Hamas won the elections. And the Israelis are trying to deal with the consequences of that. In Iraq, the Shia, supported by Iran, are in power, and we are supporting them, which is an exact reversal of what happened during the 80s when we supported Saddam against the Shia threat. So a lot of this kind of jumping through hoops and stuff is a way, it seems to me, for the United States to try to deal with an insurmountable problem, which is how you alter the political culture of an entire region of hundreds of millions of people. And the answer to that, the how, is you can't. The United States doesn't have that kind of power. We have, I'm sorry I'm taking so long on this, but let me add one more comment, which is that there's this great line, I really love it, that Napoleon supposedly said, which is that you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. And, I love that line. Don't think about it too much. But I used it a few years in the New Yorker, and their fact checkers, I hate it when they do this, said, no, he never said it. And I insisted that I could quote him saying it. Anyway, the point of it, the reason I'm using it now is because, we have this misconception. I guess this would be maybe part two of my attempt at an optimistic conclusion. We have this misconception that we have this preponderant, overwhelming power, and we don't. We have the power to blow things up in an unprecedented way. We can kill lots of people. We can destroy lots of buildings. There is no country on the history of the universe that's been able to do it in the way we can. But to build a lasting order or to accomplish the kind of political engineering that it would have taken, I suggested, to try to bring Iraq non-violently through a transition from the Sunni to the Shia, we don't have that kind of power. To do it, we would have to have a kind of political leadership that, you know, George Bush, you'd have to imagine him in a parallel universe, standing up and saying, this war is going to take 10 years, you know, we're going to lose tens of thousands of Americans, but I am putting my political reputation and all my political capital behind it because this is necessary to the American people, and here's why. And he would have had to actually back this and put all of his political strength behind it, but you know, he didn't. Why? Because he wanted the war of the imagination. He wanted the image, and he wanted it to be easy. I don't think we have the power to alter this region in the way that all we have is we can light a match and see what burns down, which is essentially what's happened in the Middle East as a result of this war. We lit a match, threw it in, and now things are burning. You know, we're saying we're, you know, going to get out and see what happens. Sorry, I'll try to answer more quickly.
There have been, I think, about 10 or 15,000 total casualties on American soil under George Bush Jr.'s watch, more than any other president, you know, in history. Given this terrible record of protecting the American people, you know, and that's a reality. How do you reconcile that reality with the party line, I'm going to protect the American people. My job as president is to protect the American people. And as you mentioned before, they might play the security card again for Iraq. I have to protect the for Iran. I have to protect the American people going to Iran. And yet, this statistic is out there, and it seems to be no one's talking about it.
Well, you know, obviously, when you look at things like wiretapping, torture, and indeed, I think the attack on Iraq itself, part of its source comes in a particularly ferocious response to an attack which the administration, by definition, let happen. I'm not saying that they could have prevented it. I rather doubt that they could have. But I think part of the explanation for the way they responded, the very aggressive way, both domestically and abroad, in torture and other kind of pushings of the envelope, if you want to put it that way, lies in the fact that they were a government that had a legitimacy problem. They'd come to office for the first time this had happened in 100 years, having won 540,000 fewer votes than their opponent. And then 9 months after entering office, with poll numbers going down, by the way, they were politically in difficult shape in September 2001, the country was attacked in an unprecedented way. So I think part of the reason they responded in the way they did had to do with legitimacy and had to do with the fact that they were determined to show obviously a strong and overwhelming response that would suggest that only they, paradoxically, could defend the country. You know, it's a paradox given that they let it be attacked, as you said. I also think this expression that you hear again and again about taking the gloves off when it comes to torture, when it comes to wiretapping and so on, you know, after 9/11, we had to take the gloves off, the head of counterterrorism said to Congress about a month after 9/11, is a fascinating expression because it implies, at the risk of being completely obvious, that the gloves were on before. You know, that implication bears kind of pulling out, you know, pull those threads. Essentially, they're saying, you know, we couldn't wiretap because of these laws from the 70s. We couldn't use extreme interrogation techniques. The CIA was handcuffed. The military was handcuffed. You know, Cheney and Rumsfeld, the key actors in the administration, both were in the Nixon and Ford administrations, saw the destruction wrought by Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War, and saw a lot of these laws passed. And they've made no secret of the fact that they believe that part of the reason for 9/11 had to do with the way the government had been handcuffed during the last 20, 30 years in the time since Vietnam, and they wanted to right that balance. Cheney has said this publicly in the wake of the NSA wiretapping scandal. So I think there's a lot that's exculpatory and responds to what you just said in the way they in the way they responded, actually, because much of what they said and much of how they acted implied that, in fact, it wasn't their fault. It was the fault of, the congressional opponents of the Ford administration and the Nixon administration who passed the War Powers Resolution, who passed FISA against wiretapping and these other laws. And I think that's a very dynamic and vital part of our politics right now that we don't notice enough, I think. We tend to consider these things as separate. There's a human rights violation. Why are they torturing? Why are they doing this? And a lot of this has to do, I think, with the reassertion of government, which is to say presidential power, which is very important to these people to an extent, I think, without parallel, perhaps, in American history, certainly in recent American history.
One more question, and Mark will be telling folks outside. Can I steal two quick ones, or just one? Tell me if you really want to get some.
This is Mark Atkinson, formerly of CBS News. So.
The New Yorker had a very interesting piece by George Packer that talked about this kind of ink spot approach that is being experimented, and somewhere between your two extremes of the predicted withdrawal and presumably staying the course or even contemplating under any certainty reconfiguring the forces in Iraq. Do you hold any credence to that strategy if the political will existed as a military matter?
Yeah.
And my second one quickly is, does your optimism about the U.S. restraint in Iran include the U.S. restraining Israel from taking action in Iran?
Well, the oil spot theory is originally a French idea, but there's an American military theorist named Andrew Krpinovich who's put it forward, and it's gotten a degree of attention here in military circles. It essentially means rather than going out and finding the insurgents through patrols, which is essentially what the Americans are doing now. I mean, their job is essentially to get in their Humvees and in their Bradleys and go out and get attacked, basically. This is what they do all day. Instead of doing that, what you do is establish these oil spots, these areas of security, in which you give the people in them a strong incentive to stay there, to report any insurgent activity, and you sort of spread those areas out. So it's a sort of offensive, defensive plan. And it's gotten, as I say, a great deal of attention. I don't see how it would work in Iraq, because again, like the Vietnamization, Iraqization plan, this is a sectarian war. In which Shias are fighting Sunnis for political power. And that's also happening at the governmental level. We tend to talk, it's strange how it's conceptualized in this country. If the Iraqi government would only get it together, they're going to cost the country an instability because they're not picking a leader, as if these things were separate, as if the government was a separate thing from the insurgency. And they're obviously connected through militias and through other forces. So it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, I've talked to Krpinovich about this, and simply said, how does this work in a given community if there are sectarian divisions? People are fighting one another. In Baghdad, for example, which you remember from Bosnia, it's easy to talk about sort of partition, but what do you do with Sarajevo? I mean, this is a city that's completely mixed. Baghdad is the same way. I don't know how you do that in Baghdad. What's the oil spot exactly? So I asked him this, and he didn't have a very good answer, at least not one I can recall was very good, I'm afraid. What was the other question? Oh, boy. I don't know. So far as I can tell, the Israelis and the Americans are playing this kind of complicated game here where the Americans like to suggest that, they're restraining the Israelis, but they don't know how long they can do that. And so the Israelis at a certain point have kind of become the bully boy of the Americans on the Iran issue. I don't know, on this issue what the Israelis are thinking. I mean, the simple fact is that if you're sitting in Tehran, you look next door on one side and you've got the American army in a very unstable situation. That's a nuclear power, the leading nuclear power in the world with about 10,000 warheads. You look on the other side in Afghanistan, you've got the American army. You look one country over, you've got Pakistan with 60-odd nuclear weapons. One country over, you've got the Indians with 100-odd nuclear weapons. You look in the other direction, you've got the Israelis with a couple hundred nuclear weapons. You want one. You know, and so, you know, to me, I look at it and I think this is the dynamic on the ground that, you know, they think of themselves as a great power. Getting a nuke is very popular from everything I've been able to find out in Iran. You know, it's nonpartisan. I mean, people who don't like Ahmadinejad still are into the nuke thing, you know, because they as it was popular in Pakistan. I mean, we have this idea here that, you know, the evil nukes. Well, the U.S. has been a nuclear power since 1945, you know, and I mean, I look at this and think, well, it would be bad if they got one. On the other hand, you know, I mean, can you imagine what if Stalin had gotten one? Oh, Stalin had one, gee. You know, what if Mao had gotten one? Oh, Mao got one too. I mean, you know, regimes, North Korea, we are led to believe, has several at this point. You know, if I was the Israelis, I would be worried about the Iranians, but enough to actually attack them? I mean, they have very serious security vulnerabilities to Iran as well, particularly on the north border. I think a direct attack on Iran would probably lead to problems in the north that might lead them to invade Lebanon again, which they obviously don't want to do. So again, you know, it's like weapons of mass destruction before the Iraq War. It's not a question of whether they're a threat. The question is, how much of a threat are they, and is it enough to justify the steps that are being proposed to deal with it? My problem with the Iraq War was that I thought the threat was relentlessly exaggerated from Saddam, and the risk of occupying Iraq was relentlessly minimized or understated. And I tend to think the situation is similar for the Israelis, although they have their own domestic politics to deal with as well. You know, you have this guy in Tehran who's saying, wipe Israel off the face of the map. You know, that kind of brings back memories of a kind, you know. And so they have a particular political complex to deal with. Anyway, I wish I could give you a more, you know, definitive answer on that. Thank you very much for coming tonight and listening to me.